everyone to the first NRIN Happy Hour of 2026. So NRIN holds happy hours every second Thursday of the month at 4 o'clock till 5 o'clock, and we covered all different types of topics on research integrity, research ethics, research, responsible conduct of research, and more. So please keep an eye out on the NRIN website for the upcoming NRIN Happy Hours. The next one is scheduled currently for April 2nd, and it's possible to sign up through the link, but also on the website. But I would like to welcome our presenter for today, Dr. Holly Hutchins. I would just like to briefly introduce her. She is the Vice Provost of Faculty Successes at the University of North Texas and is responsible for providing strategic leadership to ensure transparent and equitable faculty-related academic policies, effective communication processes, diverse and inclusive learning opportunities, recognition processes and events. She also coordinates with other academic affair units to address faculty human resource issues and provides counsel on developing healthy, just, and sustainable workplace climates. But Dr. Holly Hutchins also is now working on researching the imposter phenomena among higher education faculty. She was one of the first researchers to link imposter phenomenon to work outcomes, and specifically among academic and medical faculty. So welcome, Dr. Holly Hutchins, and we look forward to your presentation today on navigating your work imposter. So I would like to hand over the floor to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barbara. Thank you, Rita. And it's so wonderful to be across the continent, a long way from you in Amsterdam and the Netherlands in general. But I'm so excited to be meeting with you to talk about this really topic that has driven my research for now over a decade. And really excited to talk with you about how that started, the research that has really come out, given the focus on imposter phenomena and the impact on work outcomes, and a 4-step workshop framework that was really born out of the research and looking at it as a job aspect. So again, thank you for being here. It's wonderful. And I see the participant number running, so it's definitely resonating with a lot of people. So I'm curious how many of you can relate to this cartoon and the statement above it. So if you're nodding your head, or it's yeah, either it's me or you know someone that have had these thoughts, then you're certainly not alone. I certainly felt like this, and I used to say, as an early career researcher, when I finished my PhD in 2004 and went on to be a faculty member at the University of Houston, I certainly had these experiences, and it was a little bit of a surprise. But I did feel like when I was hired with 130 other faculty, I felt very much like this. All these people must know what's going on. I don't know. I know what's going on a little bit, but I'm really not sure. And it was quite the experience in terms of how I felt like I fit in, how I was engaging with my responsibilities as a faculty member, my satisfaction overall. And I just started experiencing a lot of anxiety. I started experiencing, doubts whether or not this was really the career for me, even though I had spent, lots of money and lots of time, almost a decade and a half working toward being an academic. And so one of the things I want to really underscore is that it's not that you have, doubts. It's not that you question yourself, particularly as you are going into a new career at the beginning of your career, making a career transition. It's whether or not these are persistent and actually become negatively affecting your overall well-being. And I'll use that term generally because we know that well-being is such an important predictor of the job outcomes that we're concerned about. And so these are some of the thoughts that would be pretty persistent with me. When is someone going to find out that I really don't know what I'm doing? And just to put that in a context of an academic, is that, there are 3 main responsibilities of you as an academic within a research university, and that is excellent teaching, innovative scholarship or creative activity if you're more in the humanities or the arts, and then just being a good university citizen. And two of those I knew how to do. I was trained really well. But as I was entering an institution that was going from a high level of research activity to a very high level of research activity, and the new faculty were the ones really carrying that mission, I began to really struggle with whether or not I could hit that level in terms of my research. And so I began looking around and saying, oh, everyone is, succeeding except me. And when I would have successes, instead of internalizing that positive feedback, I would just attribute it to luck. Again, these are very normal thoughts. They're very normal feelings. But when they begin being persistent and getting in the way of you doing work, and you finding satisfaction in that work, that's when we become concerned about that. And that's what was happening with me. And so I am curious. We'll do just a little bit of interaction here. This is a bingo card, and so it has a lot of the thoughts that and experiences that people who I've interviewed, I've done research on, other researchers have done is, these are some of the common thinking patterns or thoughts that come up with people who struggle with imposter phenomena. So I'll just give you a few seconds here to see how many of the squares that you can complete. And you won't have to share it. I can't see what you're, any sort of indication here. But I'm curious how quickly you'll get a horizontal or a vertical line, which would be a bingo. When I use this in other workshops, it's usually under 10 seconds. And so here are some of the stars on my bingo card, and some of the things that even now, I'm 28 years as being in higher ed, as a faculty member. I'm now an administrator. So sometimes I'll combine those roles. Sometimes they're very separate. And yeah, even now, and with a new experience, a new situation, sometimes I still have those thinking patterns. The difference, though, is what I'm going to share with you now, and that is I've learned to normalize these. I've learned to recognize these, and I've also learned what resources I need to actually cope with these. And so I want to give you a working definition of imposter phenomena. If you've done any research, I know, Barbara, this is something that you're really focused on with your dissertation. There are a few different, definitions out there, but essentially they boil down to, the experience of fraudulent thinking patterns or thoughts and the inability to internalize personal achievement. And I really should include persistent here because, again, a lot of this is very normal. But again, when it reaches levels of persistence, rumination, I'm thinking about it all the time, it's getting in the way of the outcomes or the relationships or the career goals that I want, that's when it becomes an issue. The irony, though, is that imposters are objectively competent and successful. So when I would run these workshops or have conversations with colleagues, and these are almost primarily within higher ed, but not exclusively, these individuals were highly competent. In fact, some of the first research that began in the late 70s around imposter phenomena were with highly competent, highly successful, highly degreed individuals. But what we found is that these individuals are telling themselves a very different story. And we know the power of stories. We know the power of what I'm telling myself, and that becomes our reality. And so if you've listened to TED Talks, I have a TEDx talk out there about it. But there are, several people that really focus on helping highly competent individuals, as you can see, unmask, mitigate. We use a lot of different words to talk about that. But this is something that we have certainly seen as a work development challenge. And so there's a backdrop of my TEDx talk several years ago. So I got really curious about this. I shared with you earlier that I experienced this as an early career faculty member. I got the help that I needed, but I really, one of the big issues was I just felt very isolated. I didn't think or perceive anybody else having this experience. And then as I was, talking a little bit more about it, seeking out social support, I found out that a lot of people were experiencing it, and some people were a little bit more delayed. So if you think about a cohort of faculty coming in, their first 6 years, at least in the US, we call it probationary. And then you go up for your, a big review, and that's when it recognizes either, you're getting promoted and then tenured. And so by that time, I felt like I was getting a hold of it, but I was really curious about what were the experiences among others. And so there was a lot of anecdotal feedback. And then I designed a study and sent it out to higher education faculty and teaching faculty at a medical school. So if you read between the lines, you can kind of figure out where that is. But it was in a large urban setting in the south central part of the United States. And I was just floored by the reaction. In fact, a high-level administrator who received the survey within about 20 minutes of it launching reached out to me and said, "Holly, I never thought that this was really a thing. Like it has been with me for so long. And I thought it was just me." And so quickly, as I watched the number of responses on the survey, it just was mind-blowing. Within the first 24 hours, I think we already had 150 complete the survey. So I could tell it struck a chord. And here are some of the examples of some of the research that I've done. And so my research team and I really begin, looking at this not as, okay, does it exist? What's the link in terms of anxiety or depression? I mean, all of that had been very clearly established in the research. So, what were the predictors? What were the outcomes of it? We wanted to take it in a different direction because I was seeing on the ground that this was, spilling over into the workplace, like not surprising, right? And so what we had determined is that, and some of you may be familiar with the theoretical stress framework called the job demand resource model. And basically what that says, as you can see on the screen, is that when job demands, task deadlines, other additional stress, sometimes personal issues spill over, when those demands outweigh the resources that you have, the support, the expertise, the equipment, then that leads to stress over time. And so we conceptualized imposter phenomena as a personal job demand and stressor. And when we conceptualized it that way, we began getting a lot of attention as, oh, this is actually a real thing that people should pay attention to in the workplace. We should consider it as part of our onboarding. We should consider it as part of our learning and development. And so it did get picked up as resonating with a lot of people. Like, this isn't just something that happens outside of work. In fact, we found that one's job identity, that the imposter thoughts and experiences were actually very situated in the job role. That doesn't mean, of course, that you can't experience it as a new parent. You can't experience it outside of the job, but we found that that was the most salient experience and identity and role where it existed. So I'll walk you through really quick the cycle of how it typically happens. So as job demands increase, we need to create or conserve resources. So if you can think of a very busy week in your role, and it's stressful. You may not sleep very well. You're running on coffee or tea. And so, you have a lot of demands. Well, if you don't get that extra sleep, or if you don't get that extra help as part of your team, or delegate more tasks, what happens? You get burned out. And over time, not necessarily in a week, but over time, if it accumulates, then it actually prevents a lot of resource loss. And so the way we conceptualize it is you'll start with the project or piece of work. So for me, it was a research article or a research study. So I'd have that project or piece of work. It would immediately trigger anxiety, or like, can I do this? Is it, will it be accepted for publication? I'm not really sure that I'm a strong researcher. Like, I'm not sure I'm a strong methodologist. All the things that weren't really true. But I started telling myself a story that anytime it took me longer than maybe my colleagues to work on parts of my publication or get the data. I mean, as research integrity people, there are a lot of moving parts, right? In terms of collecting, analyzing, distributing research, right? And so the anxiety and self-doubt would happen. One of two things would happen. I would either over-prepare, burn myself out in a way to make it perfect, or I would procrastinate. I'd push it off. And the more I push it off, the more the anxiety would increase. So it became this very vicious cycle. I would complete it, usually by the over preparation. I'd have a feeling of, oh, I've done it. But instead of turning that back in and saying, I did it because I was persistent, I worked, I was able to coordinate my team really well in getting this publication out, I turned that into more of a negative story. Whew, we're just lucky that time. I don't know how we did it. And so the thinking patterns became a really powerful source of reinforcing, this idea of an imposter. I'd push away any positive feedback. Oh, I just got lucky. And then it would start a vicious cycle again. So I won't walk through all the other pieces, but you can see how that becomes a really negative feedback loop. And if you know anything about the way the brain works, it creates neural pathways. And the more a pathway is developed, the easier it is. It's like a slippery slope for that thought, story, reaction to happen. And so I mentioned before, I didn't really tell anyone what was happening. I one of the biggest resources is social support, is talking through it, is reframing, but I wasn't doing any of that because I thought it was just me, another story, right? And so here were some of the outcomes. The demands increased because I got behind. I wasn't sleeping well, all the things, right? And it can lead to these outcomes that have been established not only in my research, but across others doing this work. Okay, so just kind of in summary, what does the research say? Well, it is linked to our work identity and it functions as a personal demand. I've already talked about that. It's additive to our work stress. So if you see someone experiencing a lot of stress, they're a high performer, maybe they're even kind of a mid-level performer, but it's related to kind of where they are in development, and they're opting out of career opportunities, they're engaging in maybe more negative, perfectionism. Maybe there's something going on with that. It is very common. I talk to our new faculty about it. I talk to mid-career faculty about it, that it doesn't mean everyone experiences it, but left unchecked, if it starts to be persistent, then again, it can, have some of these outcomes that we talked about. And I'll talk about triggers in a moment, but it is very negatively or adversely related to some of these outcomes. And these are outcomes we know that are related to performance, right? Related to creativity, innovation. These are the things we want to create, with our employees and with our teams. Work climate, huge factor. So a lot of the research in the beginning focused on these individual factors. They even looked at birth order, which was interesting. And because it was very much around a clinical psychological perspective. But what we know now is that the climate, whether it's a competitive climate, whether it's a, supportive or not climate, if there are biases inherent to this, there's a lot of research looking at stereotype threat and how the work environment can trigger, a reinforcement of a stereotype. Work climate plays a huge role, and as leaders and as co-creators of climate, that is something we need to look at. Who is benefiting, who's not benefiting for the way that we run our teams and support our employees. We typically, cope in different ways, and a lot of my research has looked at negative versus positive coping, and here are some examples of that. And it was really moving as I sat with, because it was a mixed method study, so I interviewed many individuals, and just hearing their stories of how they would overwork or they'd self-medicate in different ways. They would just, check out of work, push it off, procrastinate. And that, of course, would just, maybe it would give a little bit of the relief initially, but it really didn't get to the root issue. And then, as I'll talk about in just a second, there are evidence-based ways to do this. A lot of the research focused on, journaling or self-affirmations. And I would say yes, and those also may not get to the root issue. They're helpful, but there's also not been a lot of established research on this. So, one of the things that I found when I started working on this project was people would say quickly, yes, I relate to that. My bingo card was full. But tell me what to do about it. And so I got really curious about how other frameworks and other researchers were addressing stress in the workplace. And so I worked with a psychologist at the University of Houston, where I was faculty at the time. She did a lot of work with the veteran affairs community. So veterans, military veterans, and also women who primarily, but others who have gone through domestic abuse or trauma struggle with post-traumatic stress syndrome or PTSD. And so her research team had been exploring a cognitive processing therapeutic approach to help individuals cognitively reframe and understand and get to the root cause. Well, this was a 14-step framework. It was applied in a clinical setting, and I was looking for something that was not clinical, that could be part of a psychoeducational, framework, and something that was fewer in steps. That was really a tall order, but I was so fortunate to work with her and her graduate students to create and to really come up with 4 steps that I'd like to just quickly walk with you through. That it really focused on this idea of what am I telling myself? So the first, and I created a day-long workshop. Sometimes it goes over into 2 days because there's a really great opportunity to reflect between the sessions. The first is really tell me a story. And I have individuals write out, not on AI, not on your computer, but actually, write out a story of a time that you experienced a pretty significant imposter, in a series of imposter thoughts. And I also say, or someone just to give someone a little bit of an out. But a lot of people write for the first time about an experience. And I ask them to not spend a lot of time telling me the data. You can, set it up, tell me who was there, tell me the issue, tell me the context. But the bigger part of that story is what did you tell yourself about why it was happening? And the importance of that, and I keep it short, like no longer than a page. The importance of that is it's fine to talk about the characters involved and the trigger event, but what's more important is what was that story? So you heard my story in the beginning, right? But I also said, and I was telling myself these things. That's what I wanted to focus on. So that's why it's a cognitive processing approach and not a cognitive behavioral approach. Those two are similar, and you've probably heard about cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, but the processing part is really about the cognitions. And so that's the first part. It's a pre-workshop assignment. They bring it into, we keep the workshops to about 20. And I've done this in the academic setting, but I've also done it in, professional settings with biotech firms and whatnot, and different leadership teams. And so I invite them to pair up with one other person. And we do we create a lot of safety, points and normalize the experience so that, keeping it to a small group and also, establishing some trust in that group is really important because for some people, as I mentioned, it's the first time they're talking about it. And so I invite them to read, to share their story. And so as the other person listens, they are looking for step points. And step points are like, the stanza in a song, right? It's like the repetitive melody in a song. And so it's the recurring messages around those, very now worn pathways that you're telling yourself. It typically falls within an if-then pattern. If I get recognized for something that I did well, then I just tell myself and others I was just lucky. If I were really meant to be fill in the blank, a faculty research integrity officer, a consultant, a faculty teacher, then I would feel more confident sharing my ideas, right? And then when it's outside of an if-then, which is fine, and these are all actually from our research. I tend to have moments when I don't know what I'm doing in my role. I spiral into negative self-talk, et cetera, which makes me create, more doubt around myself. And so, all of these things are very common. And I'll focus in on the third one because there are a lot of different ways you can take that. I tend to have moments when I don't know what I'm doing in my role. I think everybody would say, yes, I've had that experience. But there's a way then to opt into a different narrative than I spiral into negative self-talk chatter, right? And so that's what we really wanted to focus on is what are you telling yourself about that? And so as the dyads are sharing, there's a power in, I am talking about this for the first time. I've never given voice to that. So just acknowledging that and having a safe space and having someone say, yeah, it normalizes it. I talked earlier about this idea of, it happening as you, acquire skills. So early career, I really expected to see this more salient when our early career, and I'll say 1 to 6 or maybe 1 to 7 years. But what I was surprised in the research is to find that even individuals that had acquired, they were proficient, they were expert at this very high level, still experienced it. They still experienced it. And so what I'd offer to you is that this is just not an onboarding issue. There may be a prevalence of experiencing it more so. But what we found is that it also happened with different triggers in the environment. So it oddly happened around successes. I would have individuals that would get an award or have a recognition, and they would say, Holly, it would just set off this spiral of like, I don't want attention. I just got lucky. Again, some of the same self-talk. When people would hear other people's successes or things that they had accomplished, sometimes that would. And that's when, when you look at your climate, I mean, is it highly competitive? Are people internalizing some negative messages because they're trying too hard to compare to others? I mentioned new opportunities or challenges within the workplace, and that sometimes can tamper down on career advancement. So when executives say, "Well, I don't know why this group of individuals isn't advancing," well, there's a lot of reasons. There are a lot of reasons for that, and one thing that we're not looking at is, are they opting out because they're telling themselves they're not ready? Being the first and the only, a lot of individuals with marginalized identities, with racial bias and those sort of things, are experiencing racial bias. A lot of times there's that invisible labor and that invisible, almost internalized racism sometimes, because they're not feeling supported. They're feeling like they're questioned more often than perhaps their dominant or majority counterparts. And so it's also very important, not to assume that it's just an individual issue. And that's where, the focus now is shifted to a lot of the climate issue. And of course, I mentioned climate here as well. So the third piece of this is to challenge the stuck point. So this is usually where we have, the day two. And so I've told this powerful story. I've identified my recurring messages. So now how do I challenge it? And we get the dyads back. And so I have a list of several questions. These are the most popular questions that dyads use with one another. So as I'm telling the story once again, in the stuck point, my dyad, my partner, then says, well, what is the evidence that you don't know what you're doing? What's the evidence that everybody else knows what they're doing? And when we delve into that, we start getting close to that root cause. Well, everybody just seems happy. Well, does that mean that they are? Does that mean, how much of the stuck point is exaggerated? I'll never get promoted, or I'll never get something published, but you have in the past. What makes this different? So a lot of times we start digging in and pulling out the threads of that stuck point. And by this, the use of challenging questions can help that person, as I say, or other people said, give it some air. Begin looking at these stories you've been telling yourself, because stories that we tell ourselves almost are unconscious, right? They happen so quickly. So individuals will write little notes around their computer on their whiteboard about, okay, if I'm starting to question myself, and asking themselves these questions in addition to, having someone that they trust ask them this question. Another piece of this is, are there thinking patterns that are my go-tos? And not just in this setting with thinking about imposter phenomena, but in general, exaggerating or minimizing, predicting the future, jumping to conclusions, all or nothing thinking. Everybody else seems to be fine. Remember that first slide I showed you? So when we start becoming aware of our thinking patterns, we can slow the thinking down. Some of you may be familiar with this concept of a ladder of inference, how we observe something in the environment and we quickly go up the ladder to then take action because we're building it on assumptions. And that can go so quickly. And we may find out, oh, those assumptions were accurate about other people and their successes, right? And so we spend a good deal of time after we talk about, using these challenging questions, is also to reflect on, am I jumping to conclusions? And is this also almost fortifying that negative thinking pattern? And the last piece, I know we're getting close to time, is I'm going to ask you to retell your story now. Now that we've pulled it apart, now that we've looked at your stuck points, now that you in front of someone that you're building a lot of connection with, helping you unpack that. And what we found is that when they retold their story, they began making different attributions. Well, I told myself that I really wasn't cut out for this, or I must not be as successful. But what it really was is I was really struggling with understanding this part of it. And I know now that asking someone for help or getting mentoring or actually doing some self-learning would be a way to help me better understand that, and not this whole story of, I'm not good enough. And so it becomes a part of reframing, a part of, looking at your attributions. And in the post workshop feedback is what we found. I even had a faculty member who's now a dean at another institution, tell me that, gosh, Holly, it was like stopping a runaway train, because I would have these anxious moments. I'd push the work away, which made me even more anxious. And then, by doing this, I can become aware of when I'm starting to spiral, and I can stop it. I can reach out to someone. I can engage in some of this on my own. But I now know there's a way to explore it in a healthy way. And so I'll wrap up here. You're more than your work role and identity. We often talk about your board of advisors. And I realized early in my career that I was giving way too much attention to my work identity. You are not your work. Plan your week around rest and wellness. One of the things we find is, getting out of the work role, exercising, healthy habits, especially if you're starting to cope negatively. Social support, really, really important. And for I don't know about you, I know a lot of people, but there's about 3 that I would trust processing with this, so cultivate your tribe, know who those people are. And then again, maybe there are some additional resources that you need. And I just really encourage you to explore some of those. They were incredibly helpful for me. Don't believe everything you think. That's a really important part. So here's my TEDx talk. I think that you'll have the slides available. You can click it on, and that's when I lived in Sugar Land, right outside of Houston, Texas. So I am happy to answer questions for you, Barbara and Rita. I hope I didn't go too much over time, but thank you so much.